I'm Mike. I'm a web developer. Do we have any other web developers here? No? Oh, okay. Well, good, because the second half of this talk is actually going to be about farming. So, I work for the Australian government, and in the first talk today, Matt said he showed you a picture of a government homepage, and he said someone designed this. And I couldn't help but think to myself, well, no, actually 80 people designed that. So that's kind of what I do at my day job, and I do the best that I can to make those websites accessible for people. And that can get quite stressful at times. So when I'm not doing that, I like to experiment with code, and experimenting is one of my favourite things. You can find some of my half-baked ideas on CodePen or GitHub, and occasionally I write something a bit more detailed on my blog. Also, as part of the deal working for government, I need to say that I'm here independently. But that, of course, goes both ways. So if there are any decisions you guys don't like, the chances are I probably wasn't consulted either. We can cut that out of the video, right? Okay. So if you haven't seen the title of my talk, it's A CSS Eulogy. So thank you all for coming on this sombre occasion. It's not a eulogy for CSS itself, although the landscape is certainly changing, and that's something I want to touch on. I don't think we're saying goodbye to CSS anytime soon. Rather, this talk is about reflecting on some of the patterns and techniques that we regularly use and asking ourselves, is this really the best way, or have things moved on? And surprisingly, the answer to that might not always be obvious. I'll be honest, it's not going to be easy. We're going to be laying to rest some much-loved patterns and designs, ones that have served us well over the years. So lean on the people around you if you need. Be prepared to reflect on negative margins, lament your love of gratuitous clear fixes, and rue the days before pixel-based certainty. We'll also be acknowledging Flexbox, Viewport units, and CSS transforms, among other worthy newcomers, to carry the legacy of techniques that came before them. And finally, in the course of this, I hope to demonstrate some methods that you can use now that will help you move on. As you know, things in our industry move quickly, and legacy is something we're constantly dealing with. As a result, we don't always move on as quick as we should. Often we cling to outdated techniques. It's either out of fear or comfort. And I want to say it's okay to not want to let go. In the dying days of IE 6 and 7, despite our rocky relationship, I often found myself reaching for the comfort of a robust star hack. And to this day, where inline block is concerned, in my heart, Zoom will always be one. What I'm getting at is, like anything else, our habits when writing CSS can become ingrained and difficult to change, even though we might know better. And I think what's needed is some proper acknowledgement of this so that we can all grieve and move on. So, cherish the memories as we say goodbye to one of our fondest friends, the clearfix. And I think you all know what I'm talking about when I say a clearfix. It's a hack to make a container self-clear its floated children. And it is, of course, an incredibly versatile hack, and one that underpins a lot of patterns we use today, including media objects, navigations, and grids. In fact, we use it so often that we forget it's a hack. But if you've ever tried to explain what a clearfix is to someone who doesn't know, you might have realised that it actually makes very little sense. Although it may seem like second nature, floats were never meant for solving the majority of problems we ask them to solve, and they require hacks like clearfix to make them work. Why should we have to do this is a perfectly reasonable question, and we've come to accept that this is maybe the de facto way to solve this problem. No more thinking required. And I think when we get to that point, we maybe fail to see better options and become close to new ways of thinking. So before we get onto those new ways, I think because it's a eulogy, it's fitting to have a look at the life and evolution of clearfix. It's been good to us, and it seems like the honourable thing to do. This is, of course, a primitive ancestor to our modern clearfix, or those of you that know anything about animals might say it is a chimp. And okay, very clever Melbourne. However, he's a very symbolic chimp. And the reason he's so happy is he's just discovered that he can force a container to clear its floated children by adding an empty element at the bottom of a container with the properties clear both. It was a simple and fairly elegant solution, but it wasn't semantic. And real developers don't use empty elements. What this chimp didn't realise was that, like a fish taking the first evolutionary steps out of water, the next few years were about to be a little bit awkward. And I hope that you'll forgive me for extending that metaphor, but it was totally worth it just to get that on a slide. But there is a point. My point is that our early clearfix tricks were not exactly pretty. You might remember examples like that. I don't expect you to read it all, just glance at it with a fond nostalgia. It contains various hacks to target specific browsers, but in each case those hacks are trying to achieve the same thing. That is to trigger an internal browser rendering property known as block formatting context, or has layout in IE. If you don't know what block formatting context is, simply put, it's the devil's magic. It's a rendering context that can only be triggered indirectly by CSS, and it's what all of our early clearfix hacks were about. One of its side effects happens to be clearfix. But pretty soon, browsers lifted their game, and we didn't need all these different tricks. I call this one a transitional stage clearfix. It still has some of the hacks, but it's not as scary. And sometime in 2011, Nicholas Gallagher improved on it again and gave us the micro clearfix. If you're using a clearfix today, it should look something like this. And the interesting point to make about this one is it pretty much brings us full circle. Like the earliest example, we're back to adding an empty element at the bottom of a container with the property clear both. And the only difference is that this time it's a pseudo element. That's why I think it can be useful to take a look at the life and evolution of patterns, because sometimes I think it can point us to the future. So just a quick show of hands. Who's used a clearfix in the last 12 months? Okay, and of those of you that put your hand up, that was nearly everyone, who's used it in the context of a .clearfix type utility class? A lot of you. I suspect that at some point all of you have, and it's something I'm guilty of as well. I'd be willing to bet you my left hand, and this is my left hand if anyone wants to know what they're getting into, that we'll be saying goodbye to this technique once and for all this year. And there's two reasons that I think that. Firstly, there's a lot of options that we can use now that don't require us to have a clearfix at all. But more importantly, in terms of a .clearfix type utility class, I think that preprocessors like less and SAS have made a huge difference here. Previously, it might have been easier to write a utility class and add the class name where needed in the HTML. This was obviously quicker than writing the same clearfix on multiple components in our style sheets. But of course, with mix-ins, we can write it once and use it where needed. Again, this is something I had some difficulty letting go of. I don't know if you can read that up the back, but it kept me up at night for quite a while. And I'll always have fond memories of this. I used to call this the clearfix shotgun approach. If you don't know how to solve a layout problem, just clearfix all the things. This was particularly common in large teams with multiple developers, and it was always a nice surprise to open a document and find this. It wasn't until preprocessors gave us placeholders that we were able to forcefully put an end to this. Placeholders differ from regular mix-ins in that they're not rendered to the final style sheet except where they're used. So this means that there's no need to have a utility class in your style sheet at all. In general, I think that modern tools like preprocessors and auto prefixes can be great to help you in times of grief and when you're having difficulty letting go. And I think you should lean on them. To test my theory on the decline of the clearfix utility, I wrote a little script to check for its presence. I then visited the blogs and websites of all the speakers and organisers at CSSConf, because that's a great way to make friends at a conference. Luckily, when conducting this little test, I found that the utility class is indeed out of favour. Of around 50 odd websites I visited, I think only 5 had a utility class. And those that did tended to be the larger blogs and websites that maybe have legacy code or rely on frameworks. And to be fair, this did include one large government website. So I hope I've convinced you that maybe we don't need a utility class. But do we need a clearfix at all? And the answer's depends. Maybe not. But in a lot of situations, there are better alternatives. And I think it's time we took a look at some examples. So firstly, if all you're doing is laying out content in columns, then you might consider, funnily enough, CSS columns. And you might say that support for columns is still a little bit sketchy, but in my mind it's just an enhancement, and you can have it in everything from IE 10 on. So if you need to support columns in older browsers, there's techniques like display table or inline block approaches. My view is if you don't need a grid, you probably don't need columns in IE 9 either. So I think we can take a look at a slightly more complicated example. This is, of course, the media object. The media object was popularised by Nicole Sullivan, and it's the poster child of object-oriented CSS. It's been a pretty solid go-to pattern for a number of years. Traditionally, it involves an image inside a container with the image floated to one side and a heading and some text to the other. Apart from the container requiring a clearfix, the content also needs a block formatting context or a left margin equal to the width of the image to prevent the text from wrapping underneath. So without hacks and magic numbers, you can run into some problems like this. And I see these a lot when exploring the web. So how can we rethink this once robust example to get rid of its reliance on clearfix? I found a solution by this guy. I don't really know who he is, but his solution looks pretty good. Harry wrote about something he calls the flag object, and it's more than a poorly disguised rebranding of the media object. It improves upon it with additional versatility and added options. So we can vertically center the image, or we can align it to the bottom in the top two examples. As well as this, because the image isn't floated, its container can extend to the full height of the component. This means that we can have different background colors for different sections, and that's something we can't do with a traditional media object. It relies on display table and table cell, and personally I feel like display table is something that's often criminally overlooked. I wouldn't use it for laying out an entire site, but I think used in moderation in components like this, it can be very useful. And this example is supported as far back as IE 8. But if you're ready, there's also perhaps an even more versatile implementation that uses Flexbox by Philip Walton. This is from his site, sold by Flexbox. Like the flag object, this implementation allows us to position the image however we like. But in addition to that, we get source order control, which means that we can put the image on the left or the right-hand side of the component without changing anything about the HTML, which is very handy. As well as that, we get other fine-grained control over the layout of all the different parts, and that's something that's inherent in Flexbox. I don't want to go into all the different alignment options and possibilities available with Flexbox because that could be an entire talk, but suffice to say that Flexbox gives us greater control over layout than any of the techniques that we currently use. As well as that, because these techniques are built in to Flexbox, they're incredibly robust, which means we're not relying on hacks. And yeah, you're much more comfortable using them. So you can find examples of that in other patterns on Phil Walton's site, sold by Flexbox. And if you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend having a look at it after CSSConf. So I'd just like to take a moment to reflect on clearfix. We've loved you and you were there for us when things were tough. You'll always have a place in our heart, but sadly we no longer need you like we once did. You may be destined to fade into obscurity, but you will not be forgotten. Thank you, clearfix. But of course we can't dwell on our sorrow for clearfix too long, because there's other patterns we want to say goodbye to. And one of those that I'd like to touch on is negative margins. Despite their image as a hack, negative margins are often used exactly as was intended. They're well described by the CSS specification. And I'm not firing at negative margins in general, but I do think that the use of negative margins tends to be a symptom of poor choices in our CSS. With new layout options available, I'm finding fewer situations where I actually need negative margins. One practical example of negative margins that I do want to focus on is a pattern that I've used hundreds of times. It's one that's, again, felt really robust and comfortable for a long time, and it's probably familiar to a lot of you. I'm talking about modals, or more generally, positioning any element in the centre of the screen. It might be a logon box or a message or some kind of user interaction. Or you might be asking me to share your article on Facebook before I've even read it or determined if it's relevant. Of course, if that's what you're doing, you can just stop. But there are legitimate uses for a pattern like this. And although it might not be as close to our hearts as clearfix was, let's take a quick look at the life of this pattern. So historically, we might have used an alert or a confirm dialog, but these, of course, were ugly and obnoxious, and we couldn't change a thing about how they looked. So understandably, we all just avoided them in favour of custom options. Oh, so do I want to go to the next slide? Yes. Okay. Yes, I did. All right. Sorry about that. What was I talking about? Okay. So these custom solutions usually involve negative margins. So the trick was to give the element an absolute position and a top and left value of 50%. This would place the top left corner of the element in the centre of the screen. To put the centre of the element in the centre of the screen, we also gave it a negative margin equal to half its height. A negative top margin equal to half its height and a negative left margin equal to half its width. You're probably familiar with this technique. Is anyone still using this? A couple? Occasionally? I sometimes find myself going to it just out of habit. But there are better ways. The problem with that technique is that the width, the height and the margins are all magic numbers. I also find that with responsive designs, I'm writing multiple specific variations of this, as well as an inline version to support mobile devices. And there might also be situations where I don't know the width and height of the element that I'm trying to position, or where they should be percentages. So that once fairly robust technique's no longer meeting a lot of my needs. To try and address this uncertainty, my first inclination was to try and make those negative margins percentages. And that's a mistake I only made about 120 times, before realising, of course, that negative margins, percentages in negative margins are relative to the parent container, not to the element that you're trying to position. But luckily, that is how CSS transforms work. Unlike negative margins, when using translate to position an element, it is relative to the element that you're trying to position. So you can say, move this 50% of its own width or 50% of its own height in any direction. This, of course, means no magic numbers. And what's more, it's intuitive. A lot of you have probably seen that technique and you might even be using it now. But this too is a transitional stage solution, I think. This pattern's on the verge of making another evolutionary step. And I'm talking about the dialogue element. It's relatively new and it only works in the latest versions of Chrome and Opera, but there are some good polyfills and you can start making use of it now. So the dialogue element, as you can see, I don't know if you can read it, it doesn't require any CSS for positioning at all. It gets automatic centering. In addition to that, we get, it scales, because I've set the width to 70%. But in addition to that, we get this backdrop pseudo element. And that's really quite nifty to quickly set pink background overlays, because that's something that was always relatively difficult with CSS. As well as that, we get show and hide methods for free. So it's a lot better than a lot of our custom solutions. And again, I think in a circle of life kind of way, this pattern has come back to its origins. We've got full control over the CSS and presentation now, but like the early examples again, we're back to a semantic representation of a dialogue with native JavaScript methods for interacting with it. And this is often how it goes. We start with a problem and a solution that doesn't quite meet our needs, and we bend it, and then we break it, and try hacks with it. Sometimes new hacks and new solutions evolve, and sometimes a new element, like the dialogue, is born. The final example of negative margins that I want to touch on is this. Does anyone know what that is, just by looking at that? You probably all said the Holy Grail layout. I want to touch on this very quickly because it's not used very much today, but in the desktop era, it was the base pattern possibly for the majority of websites. It's still kind of common thanks to advertising, but it uses a fluid central column and fixed outer columns. And historically, to achieve this pattern, we'd place the center column first in the HTML inside a container, and then we push the left and right columns into place using negative margins. We didn't do this because it was ideal. It meant that the columns sat outside the main container and tab order would be confusing. And for this and other reasons, we've largely stopped using these patterns. But again, just as we're starting to say goodbye to this technique, we've got new techniques that help us meet those challenges we were trying to hack around. And again, Philip Walton covers that example really well on his site. So it's goodbye negative margins. Our relationship was one of necessity, but you made so many things possible. And whilst it might be goodbye, it could be a chance to reacquaint ourselves with patterns whom, thanks to your hacky ways, we lost our spark. And that brings me to the final farewell. I'd like to talk about the shake-up that Viewport units are about to give some of our typography and layout best practices. Viewport units have been around since 2012 and they're fairly well supported. In fact, I think IE was an early mover and these are supported as far back as IE 9. They're relatively easy to understand. One viewport unit is simply 1% of the viewport, and there are 4 types of viewport units. VW, which is the viewport width, VH, which is the viewport height, and Vmin, which is the width or height, whichever is smaller, and obviously Vmax is the width or height, whichever is larger. So the reason that viewport units aren't used more, I don't think is due to a lack of browser support or developer understanding. My guess is it's probably more likely due to the lack of precise control that designers have over probably font sizes. And this might sound like a familiar dilemma to some of you. You might have thought that we said goodbye to pixel-based font sizes in the late 2000s. And for the most part we did. We favoured EMs and percentages because pixel-based fonts didn't resize according to user preferences. And this was bad for accessibility, if not just rude. But pixel-based typography wasn't dead. It was just lurking in the shadows, gathering its strength and waiting for the days when browsers offered zoom to enlarge text. And with that development, some developers thought that the accessibility of pixel-based fonts was no longer as much of a concern. That debate still rages, but the truth is whether we're using EMs, REMs or percentages, they're all just abstractions of a base font size, which is usually 16 pixels. So we never gave up complete control. But viewport units are different. Again, they represent an evolutionary leap, a fundamental change in approach. The viewport units are not relative to the base font size in any way. They're relative to the viewport width, which the user controls. And that might be what's scary for some. So what's good about them is it means goodbye to clunky responsive type techniques like this. As you can see, it's very jumpy. I might have exaggerated it just a tad. It also involves multiple media queries. So in addition to that, the text, it doesn't scale in proportion to anything else on the site. So it can overflow containers and trigger scroll bars, and it's just a mess. It's like feeding a gremlin after midnight. So if we have a look at that same example with viewport units, you can see that the text scales smoothly. We don't need half a dozen media queries. But when the viewport width gets very small, it becomes problematic. So luckily, there are a few methods for avoiding this. We can use a media query to only apply viewport units above a certain screen resolution. And this means that beyond that, it will just be whatever default we set. We can also use calc to say the absolute minimum font size is 16 pixels. So that example is 16 pixels plus 3 viewport widths. At a viewport width of 0, it will be exactly 16 pixels. And from there, it will scale. Okay. I should also mention that some browsers still have some difficulty using viewport units and calc together. So for now, the media query option might be safer. In the days before CSSConf, when I should have been preparing this, I was thinking more about the limitations of viewport units, because any new method has new limitations. And whilst we can limit scaling with calc, we don't have complete control yet. So I could say, for example, I wanted to set a font size of 12 pixels at a viewport resolution of 600 pixels. And for that, I could choose 2 viewport widths, which of course I just happen to know and don't have written down at all. From there, it will scale as the viewport units scale. But once we've made that choice, if we wanted the font size at 800 pixels to be something specific, we'd have to have another jump with a media query to change the viewport, or the font size with a different viewport width. Sorry, to use a different viewport unit. So in other words, we don't have complete control over the rate at which viewport units scale. Actually, it turns out that we can. I'm not going to go into this code here, but I wrote a blog post detailing how we can get viewport units to scale between a specific pixel range within a specific viewport range. The way it works basically is it takes a scale and then transposes it. So if you had the number, say 1 and 100 and the value of 50, and then you wanted to move that onto a scale between 1 and 200, the new value would be 100. So both of those values are right in the middle of those ranges. So that does this for a viewport width and then applies that to a pixel size that you want. Like I said, I wrote a blog post about this, so I won't go more into the detail there. I don't know how useful this technique might be, but the purpose that I'm trying to illustrate is that there's new hacks for us to keep pushing limitations of CSS. And for me, this is the most exciting part of what I like to do. And that's how each of the earlier hacks that I mentioned came about. So I encourage you all to get hacking and try to discover and push those limitations. 99% of the time, you probably won't discover something as useful as a clearfix. But I think 100% of the time you will discover a greater understanding of the technology you're working with, and that's almost as exciting. Okay, so like any eulogy you've ever been to, this one ends with a closing rant. Now that we've had a detailed look at the life and evolution of a few common patterns as well as some of the hacks and techniques that we've used, you might have noticed a familiar theme. Our hacks are usually just clever workarounds for the limitations of CSS, and usually those limitations that we're trying to push relate to layout. In fact, in many ways, this has been a talk about layout. That's right, I tricked all of you. That is because CSS was not designed for solving layout problems. It was designed for adding simple styles to HTML elements. And now, for the first time in 20 years, we're on the verge of an era where we have features in CSS designed specifically to help us with layout problems. And yet we're still having difficulty letting go. I'm constantly hearing that Flexbox is hard or confusing. Could we be a bigger bunch of hypocritical whingers, really? For years we complained about not having this stuff, and now that we have it, we're apathetic at best. I think without a doubt using viewport units, transforms, and Flexbox is far less confusing than the methods that we've cobbled together using negative margins and absolute positioning and clearfix hacks. So I hope I've helped you all to grieve and get some well-needed closure, but I also hope that I've helped you to move on. As I said, we're about to start a new era of CSS, and it's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult. There's going to be new quirks, new limitations, but also new hacks for us to keep pushing these boundaries. And that's what I want to encourage each of you to do. We've got Decompress tomorrow, and I want to see what each of you can come up with. So, thanks.